One or two of you who were here last year may think that history is about to repeat itself because I believe I used this slide to start my presentation last year, but fear not, it is not the same presentation. That's just to remind everybody or tell everybody that up in the northeast we have a regional violence against women and girls strategy established now 2 years ago by me, that first Police and Crime Commissioner, the Cleveland one, Barry Coppinger, and Ron Hogg from Durham. So we cover the territory with this strategy all the way from the Scottish border down to Yorkshire. That's what I want to talk about today. Last time I came, I talked about the work we were doing with victims of domestic abuse, but there is a bit of a change of orientation. I'm not saying for 1 second away from victims, not at all, but a refreshed look at the question of perpetrators of domestic violence and what we can do. The first thing to say is almost a truism, but I have cast it here just to put it in this presentation as a precursor. The criminal justice system, we are trying to improve how it tackles domestic violence. We have been doing for a very long time. It does have, at the moment, a limited role in tackling domestic violence, and you can see why. Only about a quarter of victims ever complain at all to the authorities, and so don't come through a route that will take them there. Of that quarter, if you apply that fraction to Northumbria, where I am the commissioner, so this is just my patch, not the other two, getting up to 28,000 incidents of domestic abuse which the police respond to, turn into only 4,350 or so crimes in a year. So whilst the work of getting domestic abuse onto the national agenda, getting it taken seriously and so on, which has been driven by the women's sector, supporting victims, drawing the public and the state's attention to how it works. If you ask anyone in that sector, what should we do about perpetrators, they historically would have said, well, of course, they should be sentenced by the criminal justice system. And this shows that that is not the complete answer and never has been. So stopping perpetrators, especially serial perpetrators, is not that likely on those numbers to be done by criminal justice system sentencing. Perpetrator programs, to which Louise has alluded, have historically been of really questionable effectiveness, and that's the second reason. Focus on victims, totally right, must remain, but that's the second reason why not so much effort has been put into them. But there are reasons now to look afresh at the whole question of perpetrators. And the first reason is at the top there. We will shortly, if the government is to be relied upon, be ratifying the Council of Europe Convention, and Article 16 of that requires us to have programmes aimed at teaching perpetrators of domestic violence to adopt non-violent behaviours. So we will have an international obligation to look afresh at this side of the problem. Secondly, and I apologise that I've given it the wrong name, it's called Everyone's Business. I dare say everyone here is aware what that is. That's HMIC's report into the way police forces were currently dealing with domestic abuse, 18 months old now, and it found that they were not dealing with domestic abuse particularly well. Save for 6 forces, and I'm delighted to say, indeed, if it weren't the case, I'd probably have to shoot myself, that Northumbria was doing reasonably well when it was inspected by HMIC. But what they said about perpetrators was forces need support in how they target and manage perpetrators of abuse, and they recommended that the college, through the National Policing Lead for Domestic Abuse, should disseminate to forces how other forces are targeting serial and repeat perpetrators to try to prevent future offending. The What Works Centre should provide to forces evidence about effective programmes of managing perpetrators, achieving reductions in domestic abuse, and they should work with the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office and academic institutions to build a strong evidence base. So again, a need newly brought forward to tackle how we look at perpetrators. And then the third reason is Project Mirabel, which some of you will have heard of already. The relative ineffectiveness of perpetrator programs may be a reality, or it may be that the wrong people are being put on them, and it certainly is because they have not been properly researched before. It is not easy, if you just think about the parameters, to work out how you would evaluate a perpetrator program, because if he is being coercively controlling, she, who knows what is going on, is not going to be able to tell you that your course has not worked, because she is going to be subordinated to him. How then do you work out whether it's worked? You can look at things like convictions, but we've just established that they're not much of a guide as to what somebody's behaving like. And so Mirabel had to be worked out with a great deal of care, and it took a long time. It took 5 years for Kelly and Westmoreland, who are very significant academics in the domestic abuse section, to look at the effectiveness long-term of respect-accredited perpetrator programs. That's quite an important caveat. I should mention that I'm a trustee of the charity Respect, but they are the charity established by those who've been devising perpetrator programs over the years to make sure that they accredit and that they achieve an appropriate level of effectiveness. So that's what Kelly and Westmoreland set out to do, and what they found was really quite promising, more promising than one might have expected. I'm not giving you detail, it's not my research, it's theirs. They present it brilliantly. The vast majority of men who were on these various courses stopped using physical and sexual violence, stopped. About a third of them had made a partner do something sexually that that partner didn't want to do in the past. None of them were behaving like that now. 29% had used weapons on their partner. None of them were doing that now. The ways that this was ascertained, you will have to look in more depth at the research. I'll just tell you the results. 8% of women, hardly surprising, indeed it's amazing that there were 8% of women who, the beginning of their spouse's involvement in this program, felt safe. At the end, 1/2 of them felt safe. Not so good on what you might regard as the lower but are persistent and hugely important elements of abuse. Only 2% of women, 2% more women said that their man behaved considerately. I have to wonder about that one, really. We're all looking around and thinking, do they all behave considerately? Do we? Trying to prevent somebody seeing friends or family, a very characteristic tactic of coercive control, reduced, but it was still being used. Using money and finance to control, again, an absolute piece of an abuser's toolbox. No real change to that. And what is, I suppose, important to put on the foot there is that, of course, it is the first time anyone's looked properly at the effectiveness. We have found that some of it does work very well, and that allows Respect to focus on improving these parts that have not worked so well. Those are 3 reasons to look afresh at this. HMIC are telling us to. The Article 16 obligation and this research, but that's the truth for us in Northumbria. We identified 5,519 serial perpetrators who were responsible for 17,500 domestic abuse incidents. And if you go back to the figures before, that's over half of all the domestic abuse incidents in that year. And about half of domestic homicides, of which we had 9, were perpetrated by those who at that time were recognised as serial, and each, of course, cost the force an enormous amount of money. Sorry, that's the same slide again. And so what we did, let me see if I can go back, was we applied for, is it possible to go back? I think I've skipped over a slide. One more back. Okay, I think then there's a slide missing. Never mind, I can tell you all about it. What we identified was that, as I say, so we applied to the Police Innovation Fund to tackle these serial perpetrators. Intelligent policing, crime prevention, partnership working, it hits a lot of the buttons. And how the scheme that we are piloting worked is as follows. It has, first of all, a analysis of recency, frequency, and gravity, data extracted from police systems relating to domestic abuse perpetrators who have come to the attention of the police either because there's a straightforward report or because some other criminal activity has a domestic abuse side to it and there is an identified perpetrator. And then there's a score along recency, frequency, and gravity, weighted, and it produces an identification of those who are the most harmful. This is a Police Scotland piece of work. What happens then is those perpetrators having been identified, and let me just make very clear one of the points about this, is that this is not about dealing with people when there's been a fresh complaint. We are not talking about when the police are called out, this happens. We are talking about identifying current serial perpetrators and acting on our own initiative to take them through this process. So there is now something called a MATAC process, multi-agency tasking and coordination. Everybody in this room will know about MAPA, about serious sexual offenders being by multi-agency support and other mechanisms stopped from reoffending, the public protected against them. Most people will know about MARAC, which is a multi-agency risk assessment by which all the partners in an area will come together to protect those identified as high-risk victims of domestic abuse, and they will take each a role: probation, health, local authorities, safeguarding children, police, of course, probation, and others. They will take a role in safeguarding that high-risk victim. Here is a third acronym for you, a MATAC. Again, Scottish thing, and really designed to be much less about meetings, which MARAC and MAPA are, and much more about a coordinator drawing in the right people to help. So we would identify who would come into the process, and there would be meetings 4 weekly to start with to get the thing on its feet. But the coordinator's job is to identify the most likely partners to be able to deal with the individual identified, then to decide what tactical options in a toolkit of mechanisms for controlling and dealing with this individual are the appropriate ones for him, a bespoke intervention for him. And of course, we will use this to identify best practice and what success looks like. So once a person's in the MATAC, that's what the coordinator's responsibility is. And the toolkit, it clearly is growing and is developing. But, for instance, there is a very good relationship in one of the important areas for domestic abuse in Northumbria with the housing, the social housing provider, who are called Gen 2. And they have a system now, which is one of the tools in this box, which is something like an acceptable behaviour contract. They have got a lot of experience, of course, of dealing with antisocial behaviour in the context of tenants, so they now have a similar contract with the right kind of individual who is perpetrating domestic violence. Clearly the pressure on him comes from the tenancy officer and the risk of his behaviour. Clearly, if he doesn't comply with the contract, they'll identify it from holes punched in the wall or damage to the house or from noise from neighbours. So there is a fairly simple tool which could be one of the bespoke interventions. Another one is integrated offender management. Essentially, that's used for people who are released from custody, having served a sentence. It's a mixture, and again, most of you will be very familiar with it, of carrot and stick, usually operated between police with that special responsibility and the community rehabilitation companies, carrot and stick to keep him from reoffending. Again, put now these people into an IOM system and see if that tool works to keep them from reoffending. Then there's just straightforward disruption, the sort of Al Capone type line, which all police are familiar with and which are frequently used for serious and organised criminals, for target criminals, and so on. So this is about, in the case of a domestic abuse perpetrator, it needs tailoring very carefully, obviously so as not to make matters worse, but it is about sending HMRC in if there's no basis on which to arrest him, to see if his tax affairs are in order, checking on his car, if he runs a shop and he's selling drink, is his licence in order or take it away, is he a taxi driver, if so, same again, is he running a garage and doing MOTs, these are all examples we've come across. Incidentally, if so, is he doing that properly? Can we get some certification authority in to look and see whether he does? In other words, you make him know that he is being watched, you make him know what he has to stop doing if he doesn't want to be targeted in this disruption-based way. So there are examples of what can be in this toolbox and can be picked out and used flexibly to try to disrupt a perpetrator. There is also a very interesting piece of gear. Technology is so attractive, isn't it? You can't get PIF funding really unless you've got some technology, and this is our favourite bit. We only wish that the court service would take this on, but anyway, essentially what it is it's a piece of kit. She has a phone type device, he wears a tag and also has a phone type device. It's a Spanish device, and there have been no domestic homicides since it worked. Of course, what police often do is give her an alarm at home, so that if the guy's coming near to her when he's not supposed to, she can, it will alarm, she can call for assistance. But that ties people to their house, and people do feel that they are tied into the house because they don't go out with him around. This device now, when her set and his tag get near, and the distance is set by the police, they both alarm. So she knows that he's near, he knows he's near when he shouldn't be, and the police know they're together. And so the police can intervene and deal with it. Sometimes, of course, it's just an accident, they happen to come together. But it is a tremendous liberator for somebody who's been a victim of serial domestic abuse to be able to go out and feel very safe that if he comes anywhere near, not only do they know, so they can head away for it, because it helps you go away from him, but also the police will be on the scene extremely quickly. So that's a very useful tool as well. And then there are perpetrator programs. In the first bit of funding we got, we were able to get one Respect accredited perpetrator program added, but now we've got more through the funding that we have this coming year. And this is just a quick look at the perpetrator program, not a lot about it truly, but just so you'll know what they do. Big is Bernardo's, who you'll all know. Impact Family Services is a local family support organisation. In Sunderland, Louise probably knows it. It does everything from supporting child contact arrangements to, well, a great number of other things. And Gen 2, at the bottom left-hand corner, is the housing provider that I've talked about. Wearside Women in Need is the refuge in Sunderland, and it adds that essential component to every accredited perpetrator program, which is working with the victim at the same time. There has to be work with the victim as one tries to make progress with the perpetrator. If they're still together, one tries to make different kind of progress with her and to manage the development and the change if they're going to remain together, and if they're not, still there is importance in working with her for the obvious reasons that domestic violence is very impactful. So this is its nature, it's voluntary. I mean, it's voluntary, but of course with Gen 2 behind it, if the person lives in Gen 2, and we've got funding for Gen 2 to engage all the other housing providers in Northumbria to take the same role that they're taking now. They, of course, will put tenancy type pressures upon the individual to go on to this, and often there is a pressure about contact with children that will make somebody say, yes, I volunteer, and go onto it. And I think the big organisers, they would say, even if a person goes onto it with a very sceptical, yes, I'll volunteer because I want to see my child or whatever, nonetheless, they feel that they can capture that person if it's the right person and take them through. So it's for grown-up men. It's half a year long. As you can see there, that's a problem. Keeping people on it is a problem. And that's why the MATAC's very important, because you surround the guy who's on this. If this is the one that's come out of your toolbox and he's going to be put onto that, you still surround him by people who are watching to see if he goes. As I say, housing, if he's got alcohol problems, health, and the police, to make sure that you try to sustain him there. Gen 2, and they are hopefully getting other housing providers into the same position, have very bravely granted the length of waiting lists, allocated accommodation to men who go on this programme. So if there is not a common home anymore, which often there won't be, he will be less successful on this programme if he is homeless, sofa surfing, or if he is trying to get back into the matrimonial home because he has nowhere else to go. So they will accommodate him to make sure that he stays on the programme, and also because he will be accessible to the other services in the MATAC more readily if he's in a home. So that's who it's for. 7 modules over the 26 weeks. First of all, analysing what the behaviour is. Interesting, Kelly and Westmoreland found that attitudes of men who were serial perpetrators were very traditional ones of masculinity, entitlement, possession, and so on. So that's a first element. I believe a key component is identifying the effects on children, and that can be quite a telling impact upon the perpetrator. And you can see what the rest of the criteria, the modules are about there. Gen 2 do play a huge role in this with the police. They have seen the impact that perpetrators have, often the same perpetrator moving around to other victims when one of them has been helped to escape. And, of course, the impact on their children. And there, I think, on that slide are the 2 points I've already made, that they'll help because homelessness will exacerbate family violence, and they'll not engage with support services so well if they're not at a fixed address. It's quite a brave stance all the same. And they have got the person into some accommodation of theirs. They have positive engagement work through tenancy officers. They have support for him, and they deal too with notifications through the police if he's got a DVP and a DVPO when he has to go to court, and they'll support him in that process if he has been excluded through one of those notices. This is just an interesting footnote. Local GP, the safeguarding GP, was very, very upset with Gen 2 for spending money on perpetrators and not on victims, and raised that as an issue. And so the big programme invited that GP to come to the programme and see it. He had been inappropriately referring men onto anger management courses when they were doing domestic abuse. It is quite common that happens. It's quite common too that alcohol abuse treatment is prescribed, but although people do get angry and although people do drink, they are not the reasons why domestic violence occurs. They are characteristics that go alongside it. But sending him on anger management, sending him on drink resolution will not stop him from being a violent perpetrator if that is what he is. So he now has become a complete convert to this programme and is assisting. All the GP surgery staff have been trained and now know where to refer, and we have kept the whole MATAC process wide enough available to all of the partners in it so that if some referral occurs, which is not one of the recency, frequency and gravity, they will put it into the process as it goes along. And this is what some of the men who've been on the programme already have said, that they, people on the programme will help a guy to go for his medicine, that people are learning by their past mistakes, that the course will help learning from past behaviour and to get themselves onto a better path with equality. The sport is mint, pretty well sums it up and is a very nice comment. And so we're back to the beginning with all of this, clearly a pilot, clearly well established on the top of Project Mirabel and compelled forward by the factors that I've referred to, hard, cold finance being one of them. The total cost for domestic abuse in Northumbria in 2009 was £559.4 million. And if we are tapping here into a seam of the people who are responsible for a very large part of it, then it has its own purpose. But equally clearly, it is about safeguarding large numbers of vulnerable, high-risk victims who can become the victims of these serial perpetrators. There is a great tale of monitoring, evaluation, also funded by the Police Innovation Fund, which will tell us what success looks like, whether we've achieved it, and which bits out of the toolbox, if any, have helped. There's a pilot a bit like it in 3 other police forces, but it's different because one of their tools, which frankly we could not afford out of the Innovation Fund, nor ever think we could have afforded it when that fund ended and we had to fund this ourselves, they have a one-to-one course where there is a person dealing with each serial perpetrator to try and tutor them out of their habits. But it is another example of how this thinking about domestic abuse has now gravitated a little bit more toward perpetrators. And this is not going to bring miracles. This is not the total answer. Even the research that I've backed onto did not find perfection in these courses. But I think it's not about expecting miracles. What it is a need to put a new focus on perpetrators. After all, we deal with the criminals as a rule as well. And that focus, if consistently pursued, which it hasn't really been in the past, is likely to build on what we've started here and what the other areas are starting, with new thinking, which has not historically been applied to the perpetrator side of domestic abuse. So I hope we can cut it, crime prevent, do intelligent policing with this mechanism in Northumbria. But what I hope and expect it will do too is to generate some new thinking so that we get very, very much better about how to deal with domestic abuse perpetrators.